Good morning, YouTubers. Um, this morning, while we're waiting for Hurricane Delta to hit the shores of Louisiana, I'd like to give a reflection here on the beginning of the Catholic Catechism. Um, it's the first chapter, and it says, the desire for God is written in the human heart because man is created by God and for God, and God never ceases to draw man to himself. Only in God will he find the truth and happiness he never stops searching for. So that's the end of the quote. And so my reflection is um, the catechism authors, they were appointed by John Paul II in this latest catechism. They use the word written as an indication that only God can write this desire into man's heart. And it requires this written desire. God placed this in creation. It requires a response of man to live his life fully. If we go to the first chapter of Genesis, we have this quotation in chapter 1, verse 26 to 27. We hear God saying, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and the cattle, and over all the wild animals, and all the creatures that crawl on the ground.'" Verse 27, God created man in his image. In the divine image, he created him. Male and female, he created them. End of quote. Again, that was taken from Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 27, and that's the New American Bible edition. The authors of the Catechism, using both the council documents and the teaching collected over its 20th century history of teaching, give a very clear teaching about the origin of this desire for God. This desire cannot be faked or hidden, and if a person seeks to live in the truth of God, it must also be accepted and lived daily in their own life. Ultimately, this desire for God comes from the depths of an invisible and real part of man's being. As we said earlier, uh, written as part of being made in the image and likeness of God. Both in its origins and in its final expression, man is made to serve God with his entire being. Mankind can seek to place other values alongside this one value of desiring God, but often those other values erode the purity of the original authorship of God's writing his very image in man's heart. But all created values cannot actually compete with the source of this one desire. So man ends up, as St. Paul says, in a war uh, within himself. And St. Paul uses the uh, phrase warring of the flesh against the spirit and the spirit against the flesh. We can go on day in and day out having this war in ourselves and either striving to overcome it or conceding to this, to either side. Either become obedient to the call of God, a call of union of man to union with himself, or we shun that call and try to live only in the world as someone living for the values in the world. So here, since this work is from within God's eternal being, the desire for God is never a history in God, but always present to God as his very work of creation. Jesus will say later in the Gospels, "My Father is at work in the world. I am also at work in the world." And before he leaves his apostles, he says, "I am with you always until the end of the world." So God is constantly perfecting this man's response to himself. It was only after God worked and created his image in man and saw that it was good that God could rest on the seventh day. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas interprets this work of the 7 days as being a simultaneous event, because in God there is no before or after. He's simultaneously whole, perfect possession of an interminable life. But the gospel writers, the Old Testament writers, express this as being events and different events on different days. But God is from eternity to eternity, and he expresses this in Exodus 3:14, where he says, "I am who am." John 1:14, where he said, "And the Word became flesh," and in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth. Just a final note before I close out here and upload this to YouTube. If we choose to deny this call of God to man in union with him, we deny God. Just as Jesus says, "He who hears you hears me, and he who hears me hears him who sent me." In the same way, if we deny this inner desire comes from us being made in the image and likeness of God, we really deny God entrance into our life. But God is always willing, always listening for the least response to that call. And the Old Testament talks about God's presence in our life, saying that he is the witness of our inmost spirit, the listener of our hearts, and the observer of our listener of our tongues, and the observer of our hearts. So it's Friday, the 9th at 9:30. I'm closing out. Have a good day. Say a prayer for us here in Louisiana. We can get through this storm.